Wow, it's great to be with you today. I'm excited. I hope you are too. Panama Canal. How many of you have been through the Panama Canal? Okay, quite a few of you have. I've been through the Panama Canal 7 times. Let me tell you just a little bit about myself before we get started today. I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area since 1972 with my wife. We've raised 6 children there. It's a wonderful place to live. I went to school at Grinnell College in Iowa and Brigham Young University, where I completed my graduate studies. And as Shane mentioned, I am an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. I don't teach these subjects at Georgetown. I teach project management. That's not nearly as much fun as these subjects that we'll be talking about. I grew up in the Panama Canal Zone, and that is why I am particularly excited to be with you here today. Of the first 18 years of my life, I spent approximately 14 of them in the Canal Zone, growing up on both the Atlantic side of the isthmus as well as on the Pacific side of the isthmus. And so I have a wonderful memories of Panama. I'll be sharing with you those memories as well as my perspective on the canal, the past, the present, and the future. These are our lectures that we're going through. Normally, I've been a lecturer on Holland America quite a few times now. Normally, I only give 7 lectures, but I bring a few along in my hip pocket just in case there's an opportunity. And the event director said, hey, we can plug you in for all of your lectures. So if you're a glutton for punishment, you're going to have plenty of opportunity to listen to me. Today and tomorrow afternoon, after Cartagena, we'll be talking about the Panama Canal. Today I'm going to take you up to the French effort to build the canal, and then tomorrow we'll be talking about the American construction of the canal, how it operates, and what the future looks like for the Panama Canal. After we go through the canal, we have a sea day before we reach Puerto Caldera in Costa Rica. And so I'll be talking about what makes Costa Rica different. It's really quite a remarkable country in many respects. And then as you see, I have 3 lectures on the ancient civilizations of the Americas. The Maya, the mystery of the Maya, Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs, and then finally the children of the sun, the Inca. The Age of Discovery is one of my newer lectures. I've developed a lecture on all of the ancient maritime explorers and how they sailed to the edge of the world and beyond and were able to discover new lands. Under the black flag, we've got to have a lecture on piracy, don't we? Every cruise, there's a lecture on piracy. This is going to be different. I'm not going to wear an eye patch. I'm not going to have a fake sword. I'm going to tell you about the myths and realities of piracy. So it's going to really give you a different perspective on piracy. And then the last 2 lectures are alternative history lectures. What if certain things hadn't happened the way they did? How would that affect the world that we live in today? For example, what if the Puritans, the Pilgrims, had landed at their intended destination rather than Cape Cod Bay? What if Abraham Lincoln had not issued the Emancipation Proclamation? What if Napoleon Bonaparte had gone ahead and successfully established an empire in the Louisiana Purchase Territory as he had planned to do? So it'll give you an entirely different look at history. But let's get started. Panama Canal. Those are 2 of our ships in the fleet. As you can see, a rather unusual picture. We had 2 ships going through the Gatun locks. Now, I've seen a lot of you reading this book, The Path Between the Seas. It is a magnificent book. It is the definitive work on the Panama Canal. It takes it from 1870 up through the building of the Panama Canal. It's 600 pages. So it'll take you probably most of our 21 days to read it. And also, by the way, if you're having trouble going to sleep at night, just read it a little bit before bedtime. That'll take care of any sleeplessness. But in all seriousness, it is the very best book on the Panama Canal. Another excellent book that I saw, by the way, there were 6 copies of The Path Between the Seas in the library on the first day. I don't know if any of them are still there, but you might want to check. Another excellent book is Panama Fever, written from an entirely different perspective. Written from the perspective of the men and women who lived and died lifting the shovels to excavate the canal. So it's written from an entirely different point of view. Both of them provide an excellent source of information about the Panama Canal. It's called the crossroads of the world. As you can see, many of the sea routes funnel through the Panama Canal. And in fact, I believe I was reading recently that as much as 65 to 70% of the imports coming into the eastern seaboard of the United States go through the Panama Canal. And so it's really a very major crossroads of the world in many respects. Now, we'll get a few important dates out of the way here. Rodrigo de Bastidas in 1501 discovered the Isthmus of Panama. Of course, Columbus came along a few years earlier, and then other Spanish explorers started to expand knowledge of this part of the world, and Bastidas found the Isthmus of Panama. 1502, Columbus, on his fourth voyage, swung by the Caribbean coast of Panama. He, by the way, was the first European to see the Chagres River, and we'll be talking a lot more about the Chagres River. First successful colony, 1510. The Spaniards finally put some people on shore and established a permanent colony. And then, of course, we've all heard about Balboa, became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the New World. And I'll be talking more about Balboa when we get to that Age of Discovery lecture later in the cruise. Panama City, the capital of the colony of Panama, was established in 1519. By the way, the term Panama is an Indian word meaning place of many fishes. And so there is a lot of marine life on both the Atlantic and the Pacific side of Panama. Francisco Pizarro happened to be the mayor of Panama City when he heard about riches to the south, and he set off to explore, and he found the Incas, and he conquered them. And again, that's the subject of another lecture later in the cruise. Now, after the Spaniards conquered the Incas, a lot of treasure flowed across the isthmus. In order to get to Spain, it had to cross the Isthmus of Panama. And the colonial Spaniards established a couple of routes in order to cross the Isthmus of Panama. The first one being the Camino Real, which means the Royal Highway. And it went from Panama City, or Old Panama on this map, to Nombre de Dios and Portobello on the Atlantic coast. Later on, they decided that they needed an additional trail because Panama is dense jungle. We'll be talking a lot about the jungle and its influence on all of the efforts to build a canal. And a lot of rainfall as well. And during the rainy season, the Camino Real was virtually impassable. And consequently, the Spaniards decided to create an additional trail that would go from Old Panama to the banks of the Chagres River, and then they would float down the Chagres River to the Caribbean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. They created a fort there called Fort San Lorenzo, and then they would sail up to Portobello and Nombre de Dios, which were the main ports on the Atlantic Ocean. The Spaniards had to have a way of transporting all of that gold and silver and the precious items from the New World to Spain, and they created a Spanish treasure fleet that would sail once a year to Panama. It would come from Spain, and then it would break into two different fleets. One fleet, called the Tierra Firme, would go to Cartagena, where we will be tomorrow. And Cartagena and Portobello, there was a connecting there, and all of those Inca treasures came up from Peru and went to Cartagena. And then once they had gathered all of those treasures in, they would then sail up to Havana. The second half of the treasure fleet, actually called the Nueva España fleet, would gather the treasures from the Aztec Empire. By that time, of course, Cortés had conquered the Aztecs, and all of that gold, silver, and jewels would also go to Havana. The two fleets would rendezvous there, and then proceed on back to Spain. So Panama was a very, very important part of this transportation of treasures from the New World to the Old. In fact, 200,000 tons of silver crossed the isthmus during the second half of the 16th century. And that was on the backs of mules and donkeys. There was on very narrow trails. Those roads, quote unquote, that I mentioned just a moment ago were nothing more than paved paths. And they were almost virtually impassable during the rainy season. So, the wealth of the New World was exhausted eventually. They'd mined all of the gold and silver. They'd plundered all of these ancient civilizations. And as a result, Panama became a backwater for 150 years. It was a place no one would want to go for any particular reason. Very unhealthy, very unpleasant place to go. And it was sort of a backwater and received no attention at all until approximately 1850, when an individual by the name of William H. Aspinwall came along. He owned a number of shipping companies, and he had decided, he was a man of tremendous foresight, he decided that there were opportunities, commercial opportunities in Panama. And so he was able to, in 1848, sign a treaty with New Granada, which, by the way, was the predecessor country to Colombia, signed that treaty to provide a means of transportation across the isthmus. There was no indication of what kind of transportation it would be. He just sort of had a carte blanche to figure that out, and he had in his mind all along to build a railroad. By the way, Aspinwall was a very interesting character. He was the founder of the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. He was a founding member of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So a very sort of a Renaissance kind of a man. But he decided that there would be a railroad across Panama and that his company would build it. And so he started to build it. But something happened in 1849 that changed the whole perspective of things. Anyone know what happened in 1849? Gold! Absolutely. Boy, that word really gets people excited. Gold. Got the Spaniards in a total tizzy, and we'll talk about that in some of the other lectures. But gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, actually in early 1848. But by 1849, there was a gold rush. Anyone who really wanted to get ahead in life in the United States and other parts of the world, actually, headed for California. Now, to get to California from the eastern seaboard of the United States, you had three choices at that time in the history of our country. First of all, there was approximately a 3,000-mile trek overland on horseback through hostile Indian territory. In other words, a pretty rugged experience, and it would take a long time. Another way to do it would be to sail around the Cape Horn and then up to the gold fields of California. And then there was a third route, and a lot of people decided to take this third route. Rather than 12,000 miles, you could sail 5,000 miles if you were willing to take a shortcut across the Isthmus of Panama. Talk about perfect timing. Aspinwall had decided to build a railroad. He had the charter to do that, and all of a sudden, there were a lot of potential customers coming through Panama. Well, a number of transportation companies, shipping companies, really emphasized the best way to get to the gold fields would be through Panama. A pleasant voyage to Panama, a stroll across the 50 miles of the isthmus. And does this sound like a cruise sales scheme? Well, actually, our voyage through the Panama Canal will be a whole lot more pleasant than was theirs, because it was not a pleasant stroll across the isthmus. The Chagres River, the 49ers, generally speaking, followed the path of the Las Cruces Trail. Remember the trail I mentioned a moment ago that went on the Chagres River and then had a short distance overland to Panama City? That's the route that the 49ers would take. But the Chagres River was a very untamed river, and there were a lot of rapids. Many people lost their possessions when the ships that they were on, the boats overturned, and some of them lost their lives. By no means was it an easy stroll across the isthmus. Oh, by the way, during this period of time, every week, 5 ships would depart from New Orleans to go down to Panama, 8 ships from New York City, 400 people per ship, 5,000 people a month were coming through Panama using this particular route to get to the gold fields. Now, Aspinwall decided that he would start his railroad at this location right here. And now that is current-day Cristobal Colon. And we will be sailing right by that early in the morning 2 days from now. We'll be sailing through this bay and then pick up the Panama Canal just about there. He decided he would start his railroad and start building it. And as you can see, it generally followed the path of the Chagres River and then the Las Cruces Trail into Panama City. All of the 49ers were getting off their boats here in the Chagres, the mouth of the Chagres River, and coming up the river. So it wasn't that far from where the 49ers were getting off their boats and where the railroad was beginning to be built. Well, a very important thing happened early on. There was a major storm, and several ships full of 49ers were forced to take refuge in that bay. At that point in time, the railroad had been building for approximately 20 months, and they'd only gone 7 miles. They'd made it as far as Gatun. But the 49ers said, hey, rather than go back there and then sail up the Chagres, let's just ride the railroad up to the very end of the line. And Aspinwall charged $25 per person, and from that point on in time on, most of the 49ers took the railroad to Gatun, and then they walked along the tracks as far as they had been completed. So all of a sudden, there was this railroad that hadn't even been built yet was bringing revenue in. And by the time the railroad had been completely built 5 years later, half of the cost of the railroad had been paid by these 49ers who had taken advantage of it, even though it was not completed. So it was perfect timing on the part of Aspinwall. Now, it was a horrible experience to try and build a railroad through that particular part of the world. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. This is my wife's computer, and it has a touch screen, and if you touch it, it will just jump ahead on you. So, the jungles of Panama. This is a description of that part of Panama that we're talking about, right near where the railroad started to be built. It was a virgin swamp covered with a dense growth of the tortuous, water-loving mangrove and interlaced with huge vines and thorny shrubs. In the black, slimy mud of its surface, alligators and other reptiles abounded, while the air was laden with pestilential vapors and swarming with sandflies and mosquitoes. That's where I grew up, folks. Right? Not too far from where I live were all of these black swamps and all these mosquitoes and so forth. And so that was a pretty difficult situation to try and build a railroad over swamps that, you kept piling rocks in and dirt, and they kept sinking to the bottom. Very, very difficult. As you can imagine from that description, there were a lot of mosquitoes and a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. Whoops, there it goes again. And in fact, 1 in 5 workers died each month during the years of the railroad construction. And we'll be talking more about malaria and yellow fever a little bit later on this morning. But there were a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. It was very, very detrimental. The mortality rate was tremendously high. Well, Aspinwall was an entrepreneur, and he found a way to make a profit from all of these corpses. There were medical schools around the world that needed corpses in order to teach medical students. So they'd put the dead individuals in barrels and pickle them and send them overseas. I'm sorry, it's the truth. It really did happen. And the revenue from that particular source was able to fund all of the operations of the hospital that was run for the people who had not died. So, mosquito-borne diseases, a terrible, terrible affliction for people in that part of the world. Now, a little bit of background. Panama was sort of like the Wild West at this point in time. You can imagine all of those 49ers going through from the eastern seaboard and then catching another ship up to the California gold fields, and those who had mined the gold, and perhaps some of them made it rich, returning by that same route. On that Isthmus of Panama, it seemed to be a magnet for desperados and criminal types, and there was no law and order at all. And Aspinwall realized that, hey, we can't build this railroad, we cannot prosper as long as there's a lot of crime in this area. And so in 1851, he sent a representative out to a ranch outside of San Antonio, Texas. And this fellow was going to try and recruit Ran Runnels. Ran Runnels was a retired Texas Ranger living on his ranch, sort of taking it easy, maybe a little bit younger than us, but not much more. A veteran of the Comanche and Mexican Wars, a man who knew his way around difficult situations. They were able to recruit him and bring him to Panama. He was sort of an undercover type. He set up a freight company that transported people and goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back and forth, called the Runnels Freight Company. And the people he recruited approximately 40 individuals to work for him who were very, very handy with firearms. And they were called the Isthmian Guard, in other words, a band of vigilantes. And one day, the American consul in Panama City said, "Strike now." And the next morning, 37 bodies were hanging from the lampposts on the waterfront of Panama City. The worst desperados, the people who he had observed being the individuals who were stealing, who were killing and causing all kinds of havoc. Those individuals were hung overnight. A few months later, 3 49ers were killed on their way back to the United States and their gold was stolen. The following morning, another 41 individuals were hanging from the lampposts of Panama City. And he became known as El Verdugo, which in Spanish means the hangman. As you can imagine, law and order broke out at that point in time. And the individuals who had been making a life of crime realized that if they wanted to continue living, they had to repent of their bad behavior. And so law and order was reestablished, civil society began to take root, and the railroad was finally finished. After 5 years, it was finished, and it was a golden goose from the very beginning. Talk about a good investment. 400,000 plus passengers on their way, generally speaking, to the California gold fields between 1855 and 1866, rode the railroad, profits of $11 million, and that was when $1 million was a lot of money. And so it was a tremendously successful investment. Now, in your next Trivial Pursuit game, if there's a question, what railroad was the first intercontinental railroad completed? It is not the Union Pacific Railroad in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah. It was the Panama Railroad in 1859 at Culebra Summit when the two railroad tracks met. That was the first intercontinental railroad because, in fact, you're crossing the continent at that point. It's only 50 miles, but still you're crossing the continent. So let's move on to the dream of a canal. For centuries, people had dreamed of a canal. Alvaro de Saavedra identified 4 possible routes of a canal back in 1529. Can you imagine that? So many centuries ago, he identified the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, approximately 130 miles from coast to coast, problem with that was not only the distance, but also the route of the canal would have had to go 750 feet above sea level, which made it really untenable as a route for a canal. Another potential route that Saavedra identified was through Nicaragua, using the Lake of Nicaragua as part of the route. And in fact, I'll be talking more about the current day plan to build a canal through Nicaragua tomorrow. So if you'll come back tomorrow, I'll tell you all about that. And then the other two routes were through Panama, through the Darien jungle, which is the most dense jungle north of the Amazon, and then a route where the current canal is located. Can you imagine that? In 1529, he was able to identify these various routes. In 1532, King Charles of Spain, perhaps he heard about Saavedra's projections. He sent surveyors to Panama to figure out if there was any way to establish an all-water route. His surveyors reported back, it's not possible, can't be done, and the king said, well, if God wanted there to be a canal there, he would have built it himself. So he moved on to other things. In 1814, another king of Spain, King Ferdinand VII, authorized the construction of a canal across Panama. Nothing happened. In 1821, Bolivar, during the Wars of Liberation from Spain, defeated Spain, and the country of New Granada was created. In 1838, that new country granted a concession to a French company to construct a canal. Nothing was done until this man came along. His name, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal. He had completed the Suez Canal in 1869. And that was really a remarkable accomplishment. He was one of probably the most famous man in the world at this point in time. Now, de Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a promoter. He was a marketer. He would have been right at home on Madison Avenue in New York City or L Street in Washington, where lobbyists and advertisers have their businesses. He was definitely not an engineer, but he was a charismatic individual. And at the age of 75, if you can imagine that, he decided he would take on the challenge of building a canal in Panama. This is a picture of de Lesseps with his family. Those are his children. He had more energy than I can even imagine. And Madame de Lesseps looks awfully tired in that picture, I think. Anyway, a remarkable man. And he decided that his major legacy would be the building of a canal in Panama. The canal was not a French government effort, the way that the American canal was. It was built with the money of the people of France. 200,000 people, in fact, bought stocks and bonds in a total amount of $394 million. And so he was out there on touring the country and selling stocks and bonds. He was really gathering all of the resources that he felt would be necessary to build the canal. Now, Panama was a little different than Egypt when it came to building a canal. There aren't too many jungles in Egypt, just sand, lots of sand. And so the canal in Panama needed to take into consideration these tremendous swamps and jungles that we talked about a moment ago when we were talking about the Panama Railroad. Just to give you, again, an idea of what it's like. At night, the jungle came to life. Above all, there was an invasion of insects. With each step, one's foot crushed hundreds of them. With each movement of the hand, one picked up a fistful. And with each nod, one's face brushed swirls of them flying in the darkness. Moreover, the flame of a lamp was extinguished within minutes under the heaps of their small corpses. Lots and lots and lots of mosquitoes. And of course, many poisonous reptiles as well. The bushmaster and the fer-de-lance are very, very prevalent in the jungles of Panama. When I was growing up, we did not go into the jungle. There were just too many things that could go wrong in the jungle, and there were lots of bushmasters and fer-de-lances. And did I mention the rain? Cristobal Colon is at the Atlantic entrance to the canal. And this is just a snapshot of the normal weather kind of patterns. You'll notice that there's a rainy season from approximately May through December, when there's a whole lot more rain than perhaps other months of the year. 120 inches of rain a year, 10 feet. I'm sorry I don't know the metric system, but that is a lot of rain. And when rain comes down in Panama, it's not a drizzly little mist. It's a deluge. You almost want to look for the nearest ark. When it's coming down, it is really coming down. So all year long, there was tremendous rain. And it is also very warm. You'll notice right here, this pink band is the range of temperatures from approximately 77 Fahrenheit to 86 Fahrenheit, or 25 Celsius to 30. And so in the morning when you get up, before going out and working on whatever you have in mind for the day, you don't listen to the weather forecast on the radio or the television. It's the same forecast all year long. It's going to be hot and it's going to be rainy. It's going to be wet. So that was the kind of situation, very, very different than Egypt, that faced the builders of the French Canal. And those rains, as you can imagine, really had a tremendous effect on the rivers. This is a picture of the Chagres River where it comes out into the Atlantic Ocean. But there are other large rivers, the Obispo, the Trinidad, the Grande. And in 20 hours, they could rise 20 feet, go from 3,000 cubic feet per minute to 60,000 cubic feet per minute, from small streams to raging rivers overnight. And so it was, how could you build a canal with all the country crisscrossed with these untamable rivers? Just a tremendous challenge. The equipment that they brought with them from the Suez, it worked beautifully in sand. In Panama, there are 6 major faults, 5 volcanic cores, 17 fundamentally different types of rocks. They were not up to the requirement. They were made for shoveling sand, and this was an entirely different geological environment. So they started off sort of behind the 8 ball a little bit, if you will, because the equipment wasn't appropriate for the job. But the biggest challenge of all was disease. Malaria and yellow fever were devastating on the workforce. Malaria killed more than yellow fever did, but yellow fever was terrifying. You'd begin with a major headache, and then intestinal problems. You'd lose all hunger. And then at that point in time, you would begin to have tremendous pains in your back. And you'd have trouble keeping any food down. And then as your kidneys and your liver began to shut down and internal hemorrhaging began to take place, the dreaded vomito negro was apparent, which means the black vomit in Spanish. And after that happened, seizures, delirium, coma, and death. They would try to treat it with the best medication available at that point in time, which consisted of cigars, brandy, and whiskey. Needless to say, it was a losing battle. And really to sort of bring it home and illustrate the human impact of these diseases, I'd like to tell you the short story of Jules d'Anglais. He became the chief engineer for the French construction. And he decided that he would prove to the world that yellow fever is not going to stop the building of the canal. He brought his family with him. He brought his wife, his daughter's fiancé, and his son. And he wrote, "I intend to show the world that only the drunk and the dissipated will die of yellow fever." 2 months after they arrived, on January 21st, his daughter Louise, a pretty dark-haired girl of 18, died in miserable agony of yellow fever. A month later, Danglay's young son, Jules, sickened and died 3 days later. Soon after, Louise Danglay's fiancé contracted the disease and died. And around Christmas of 1884, Madame Danglay started to show the unmistakable symptoms of the dreaded disease, and she died January 1st of 1885. The Folie Danglay, a home built for them, was completed after Jules Danglay had gone back to France to bury his entire family. 22,000 people perished. It was a real tragedy, many of them buried in Mount Hope Cemetery on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama. The French company went bankrupt. Corruption, extravagance, mismanagement. They just were not able to be successful. And so they left their excavations in ruins, they abandoned their equipment, and went back to France without having accomplished their goal of building a canal. Ferdinand de Lesseps, he was tried for fraud and maladministration, found guilty, and the only reason he didn't spend the rest of his life in jail was because he was, in his later years, he was sort of getting senile, and they had mercy upon him. And so he spent the last 3 years of his life basically staring out an open window with a 3-year-old newspaper in front of him, essentially driven insane by the horrible experience of trying to build a canal in Panama. So let's move on to the American Canal. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the USS Maine, the battleship, was sunk in Havana Harbor. And it took the USS Oregon 67 days to sail around Cape Horn and get to Havana, Cuba. It would have only taken 3 weeks if there had been a canal. And that was the importance, the strategic importance of a canal for the United States was driven home by that particular experience. 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became president. What a force of nature this man was. The canal would not have been built if Teddy hadn't become president after McKinley was assassinated, and I believe approximately a few months earlier than 1901, and then actually, he became president in 1901, so it was that year. And he became president, and he decided he would build the canal. A treaty was signed 2 years later with Colombia. The Colombian legislature felt like it deprived them of their sovereignty to let the United States build a canal. And so they refused to ratify the treaty, and it was in effect not approved. And Teddy Roosevelt, he's smiling in that picture, but he was not a happy camper at that point in time. And I don't know if you know anything about Teddy Roosevelt. By the way, David McCullough wrote a book about Roosevelt, and it's very informative as well. So, if you've read The Pathway Between the Seas, or if you will learn that November 2 of 1903, just later that same year, the USS Nashville, a gunboat, sailed into Limon Bay of Panama. November 3, Panama declared its independence. December 2, Panama signed a treaty granting the United States rights to build a canal and a concession in perpetuity, and by the way, that means forever, for control of both the canal and the canal zone. Now, if you believe that those dates happening so closely together were a matter of coincidence, I've got some waterfront property in Death Valley. See me right after the lecture. I'll be out in the hallway out there, and I've got a special deal for you, if you believe that that was coincidental. This is a fascinating story. I could take 15 or 20 minutes on it. That, by the way, is Secretary Hay, the Secretary of State. He was one of Lincoln's 2 personal secretaries, by the way. And so much of what we know about Lincoln was a result of Secretary Hay. And that's Philippe Bonaventure, a Frenchman who negotiated the treaty for Panama. That's a whole nother story. It's a fascinating story, but I can't go there right now. My wife has given me the 5-minute signal. A lot of these are editorial cartoons in New York Times and various newspapers at the time. As you can see, there were differing opinions about this imperialism of the United States in 1903. Some of them are a little bit funny, and some of them, they really drive the point home that the United States really was the main influence in Panama becoming independent. May 2, 1904, the French company sold everything, all their equipment, excavations, and so forth, for $40,000. They wanted $110 million. The United States said $40 million, take it or leave it. They had no leverage. They took their $40 million. Canal construction began in May 4, 1904, and just a little bit more than 10 years later, in other words, 100 years ago, last August, the Panama Canal opened for business. And that finishes our lecture today. You'll have to come back tomorrow to learn about how we built it. Thank you for coming.